We're going to lift up the memories of all those who were killed just 1 year ago on Shmini Atzeret by inviting Leora Fishman to share some of her reflections of her friend who was murdered. Leora has been now part of our community actively for the last 6 years. She had been a family physician for many years, and she lives with her husband Roy, and she loves nature, which she has all around her place. It has been a gift to have her as part of this community and sharing. And sadly,
before I start, I just wanted to mention, if you'd like to learn more about Vivian from a different perspective, there was a major article in the New York Times Magazine section on September 30th, focusing on Yonatan Zeigen, Vivian's younger son, and his internal metamorphosis over the last year. It's very interesting. And I apologize for being emotional, or for the way it affects you hearing me, not for being emotional. It will never be hard to remember my friend Vivian's yahrzeit, as it will always fall on Shmini Atzeret, a day we always say Yizkor, thus marking her death in larger font and more community grief than on most other days of the year. Some of you heard me speak about Vivian on Yom HaZikaron, and I hope you will forgive some repetition in my attempt to bring a woman larger than life back to life. I met Vivian Silver in June 1972 at a retreat of the North American Jewish Students Network. She was 23 and a leader in Network, which was the umbrella group for organizations serving undergrad and graduate students from across the ideological spectrum. While I, at 19, was particularly interested in Network because of my intense involvement in furthering the advancement of equality for women in the conservative movement, my organization, Ezrat Nashim, already had a member registered for the conference. As only one member was allowed to come to the conference per organization, I improvised and came as a representative of the Zamir Chorale of New York, where I sang, which was the progenitor of the Zamir Chorale of Boston, which I'm sure is well known to some of you. Vivian chaired a session on Jewish women, attended by 30 to 40 women. I was immediately impressed with her command of a group, organized, clear, well-spoken, smiling, and fair in the way she ran the group. I met Vivian again less than a year later when she was instrumental in organizing the first National Conference on Jewish Women in February 1973. There, the obstacles to full equality with men within the Jewish community were presented and discussed among 450 participants. As the administrator of one of Network's major arms, the Jewish Student Press Service, Vivian gave a public address entitled "Sexism in the Jewish Student Community," in which she told the following anecdote. Quote, "A few months ago, the World Union of Jewish Students sent out a press release advertising a Jewish college in Australia. Among the many other benefits the college had to offer were, quote, leggy Aussie beauties on the beaches. It was just a sexist statement in passing, but I thought it important enough to bring to the attention of the WUJS executive. Knowing how sensitive some men are, I, that is Vivian, decided to do it in the least antagonistic manner possible. I wrote to the WUJS exec, quote, I understand that by this phrase, no one could be accused of male chauvinism since we assume leggy Aussie beauties describes Australian men and kangaroos as well. Personally, I don't find men's legs particularly enticing, but each to one's own erotic fantasies, unquote. Vivian continued, the furor that the letter created was incredible. I had been invited to address their international conference in Antwerp on the topic of the Jewish woman. Soon after my letter reached them, I received a copy of an invitation extended to a European woman asking her to participate in the women's session to, quote, counterbalance the over-emotional reaction of the North American women, unquote. Vivian protested the description, was disinvited from the conference, and finally re-invited because she was told when she arrived, quote, I had a big mouth and made a lot of noise, unquote. In December of that same year, 1973, having finished college a semester early and looking for a job, I was hired by Vivian to run the second Jewish Women's Conference, paired with a much smaller but even fringier conference for Jewish men in the spring of 1974. She was on her way out of network as her higher calling was about to be realized, to make Aliyah to a kibbutz. A kibbutznik she stayed for 49 years until her death. Vivian Silver was born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, to a Jewishly educated family that took its Judaism seriously. She went through Hebrew school and spent her junior year of college at the Hebrew University, where she studied English literature and psychology. She decided within 3 weeks of returning home that she would make her home in Israel. During her final year in college, she was among the founders of the Student Zionist Alliance on her campus, and in that capacity was invited to its national conference in Montreal. In Vivian's words, quote, there I met activists in the Habonim youth movement who planned on making Aliyah and reestablishing Kibbutz Gezer. The day I wrote my last university exam, I boarded a flight to New York to join the group and grow our numbers. She continued, those were the late 60s, the years we thought we were going to change the world. I spent 3.5 years in New York, active in Jewish and Zionist causes, including the launch of the Jewish feminist movement in America. It was a life-changing period. During that time, I understood that in addition to being a kibbutz member, I was destined to be a social change and peace activist. Vivian's group made Aliyah in 1974 and settled on Kibbutz Gezer between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, which had disbanded in 1963 after 18 years of existence. Vivian refused to be relegated to traditional women's work on the kibbutz, mainly kitchen and childcare duties. As her friend and neighbor on Gezer, journalist Bradley Burston, wrote in a tribute to Vivian, quote, a lifetime ago when we were all new here, Vivian took charge of construction for the entire community from the ground up, a borderline scandalous job for a woman in a hidebound kibbutz movement, mired and moving backward in cementing ultra-traditional male-female roles. She had already served as the first woman in the kibbutz movement to hold the position of mazkira, chairperson, of the community. Vivian pushed the kibbutz movement to promote women's leadership in individual kibbutzim. Campaigning for women's rights, she founded the groundbreaking Department to Advance Gender Equality of the United Kibbutz Movement. While on Gezer, in addition to her day job, Vivian served on the board of the New Israel Fund, the preeminent supporter of social justice issues and organizations promoting religious pluralism, civil rights, shared society between Jews and Arabs, gender equality, and more. She also served on the boards of other Israeli organizations promoting shared civil society over the years. But Vivian was just getting started. In 1990, along with her husband, Louis Seigan, an American who had made Aliyah to a different kibbutz in the 60s, and their 2 sons, Chen and Yonatan, Vivian moved to Kibbutz Be'eri, 3 miles from the Gaza border. She worked in management at Be'eri's nationally famous printing press. She worked within the kibbutz to organize programs to help Gazans with education and training, and she ensured that Gazan construction workers at the kibbutz were paid fairly. In 1998, Vivian became the executive director of the Negev Institute for Strategies of Peace and Development, or NISPED, in Be'er Sheva. This was an NGO promoting shared society between Jews and Arabs and peace in the Middle East. Soon after, she was joined by Arab-Israeli Amal El-Sana Al-Hujouj, and they co-directed Ajik Nisped, an organization promoting empowerment projects in the Bedouin community in the Negev, most specifically aimed at women's empowerment. She also continued to spend significant time in Gaza until the Second Intifada broke out in 2000. Vivian wrote in 2018, and this is a long quote, "At the beginning of 2014, I experienced 3 significant events within the space of 1 week. I celebrated my 65th birthday, I retired, and I became a grandmother for the first time. It was a time for soul searching. I had to acknowledge that after 40 years of peace activism, the left, of which I was a proud member, had not succeeded in achieving its goal of ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I decided that I would no longer do more of the same thing, that I must find another way. In July of that year, Operation Protective Edge broke out, the 3rd war in 6 years, virtually in my backyard. When I heard that women all over the country were beginning to organize with the goal of focusing on one issue alone, bringing about a political agreement with the full participation of women from all sectors of society, I immediately signed on. I had the privilege of being among those Southerners who greeted the hundreds of women from all over the country who came by train to Sderot to launch Women Wage Peace. From that moment, I have basically lived and breathed the movement day and night. Living on the border of the Gaza Strip is a compelling factor for me. I am driven by the intense desire for security and a life of mutual respect and freedom for both our peoples. The thought of yet another war drives me mad. Like the last 3, it will not resolve the conflict. It will only bring more dead and wounded. When rockets fall in our area and the Israeli media announces that there were no casualties, I want to shout, "What are you talking about? There are thousands of emotionally wounded among us, children and adults alike." Unquote. Women Wage Peace, and now I'm quoting from their mission statement, is a nonpartisan group whose purpose is to create a consensus among the majority of Israeli citizens, regardless of their political affiliations or loyalties, in the belief that we all have common interests, desires, and needs for a peaceful resolution of the conflict, unquote. Women Wage Peace refrains from criticism of political leaders and supports positive action toward resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most telling, while the organization is open to both men and women, it is led by women because Women Wage Peace believes that, quote, women still remain, generally speaking, a missing cohort in the political arena, that women's leadership must be actively cultivated, and that women have a unique contribution to make in the creation of public accord and in the processes of negotiation. Again, quoting from her friend Bradley Burston's published obituary, "Vivian Silver was the biggest person you've ever met. Not in height, certainly, but in heart. Barely contained within that tiny body was a person who never took the word impossible for an answer. She was so fearlessly ahead of her time, doing the unheard of decade upon decade, that the rest of us consistently failed her trying to keep up." He continued, "Vivian could be steely and caustic when it was called for, just as she could be warm and sensitive and comforting, loved and loving, with a sixth sense for when and how to support people. Her countless friends, her children and grandchildren, or someone she'd never met before, someone who felt otherwise unseen and alone," unquote. I saw Vivian every few years, both on Gezer and then in Be'eri, met her husband and children whom she adored, saw her in action in her Beersheba office, hiked the hills of Gezer with her, with anemones in bloom in the late winter. She loved to laugh, to travel, and cherished being a grandmother. She had a ready, huge smile, a twinkle in her eyes, great dimples, and love in her heart that she doled out liberally but not profligately. Her beloved husband passed away in the mid-20-teens, and she lived alone in Be'eri, visited by and visiting her sons and grandchildren. After retiring in 2014, Vivian began volunteering with Road to Recovery, an organization of Israelis who drove Gazans with cancer to medical appointments in Israel. She had very basic, and as someone said, mangled Arabic, but she was known for her huge heart and outreach to Palestinians. She was said to have known more Gazans than almost any other Jewish Israeli. Some of you have read of her final living moments when her son Yonatan was texting with her that horrific morning of October 7th last year, when she, shut up in her safe room by herself, joked with him. When there was a moment of silence too long for Yonatan to tolerate, he typed, "Say something." Vivian typed back, "Something." She told him she could feel him with her. Communication ended. When her body was not found on October 7th, it was assumed that Vivian had been taken hostage. Less than 6 weeks later, forensic analysis of a piece of bone was found in her burnt-out home that confirmed that it was Vivian's. She was buried at Be'eri. Her sons Chen and Yonatan, along with friends, have established the Vivian Silver Impact Award, administered by the New Israel Fund of Canada, to be granted annually to 2 women, Jewish and Palestinian, who show great promise or have demonstrated significant accomplishments in one of the areas that embody Vivian's values and actions: building Arab-Jewish partnership in Israel, promoting Israeli-Palestinian peace, and advancing women to decision-making and leadership positions. In midsummer 2024, just recently, a community space and kitchen in a displaced persons camp in southern Gaza that temporarily succeeded in being a humanitarian zone was named for Vivian Silver and flew a banner over the space with her photo. It is impossible to know what Vivian would have concluded or had to work through had she survived the massacre of October 7th. I am absolutely certain her responses would have involved pain and nuance. She was frustrated by the failures of the Israeli left to convince more of the country that the only way through to a peaceful life was coexistence with Palestinians. But then she co-founded Women Wage Peace and refused to give up. Vivian once called herself a conditional Zionist, saying, quote, "I believe in the right of the Jewish people to have a state as long as we give the same right to the Palestinian people. This could be such a haven to both of our peoples," unquote. And again, quoting Bradley Burston, quote, "She was a person who would never surrender, not to hatred, not to despair, not to supremacism, never to darkness," unquote. The Jewish people, the country of Israel, the Palestinian people, and the world lost a pioneer, a true chalutznikit, with the murder of Vivian Silver. I lost a cherished friend for whom I will say Kaddish every Shmini Atzeret as long as I can to keep her memory and her ideals alive. Yehi Zichra Baruch.